Hey folks, Nathan here again. We are taking a look at some of my favorite deck building games. We previously looked at Star Realms and talked about the general gist of what a deck building game is, and in the process talked about how that was a good starting point because you have it designed for 2 players initially. It's relatively inexpensive, not a ton of different expansions, or at least expensive expansions to keep track of, and a fun game that doesn't have a whole lot of complexity to what you need to be tracking throughout. Now we're taking another step upward in terms of complexity, and we are checking out Ascension. And along the way on this playlist, we'll eventually check out all the different expansions for Ascension. We're starting here with the original base game. And when I say original, I mean original. We are looking here at the first edition version. They're on number 3, and there's technically been 4. The first edition version of Ascension, Chronicle of the Godslayer, now known simply as Ascension deck building game. Now, if that sounds familiar, there is a very popular app version of this game, and you can actually play with all the different sets available in that digital game, with the exception, at least as of right now, of the newest set, War of Shadows. All the previous sets, large and small, are available in the app otherwise. Now, Ian, a couple of quick things for those who are new to this playlist and are just looking at the Ascension stuff I won't repeat as we go through all the other Ascension sets. Again, a deck building game generally is designed so that you buy one box of a product and you have all the cards that you need to play. There aren't any blind boosters out there. When expansions are released, they tend to have all the cards needed for that particular either expansion or part of an expansion, in the case of Star Realms, all inside that package. There's not blind booster packs to go and spend a lot of money on hoping to get the cards that you want. It also does not involve pre-created decks where you take a bunch of cards you own, put them together with a strategy into a deck, and bring that to play the game. Instead, you build your decks as you go. That's why it's a deck building game. Everybody starts at the same base level at the beginning of the game. As you play, you are acquiring cards that subsequently make your deck stronger as you go along, as you're trying to somehow defeat your opponent in one form or another. In the case of Star Realms, we looked at it, the goal was to go after the other player directly and basically take them out to win. The ones we're going to look at from here on have slightly different approaches when it comes to what the win conditions will tend to be, including Ascension. The setup, the layout, is actually very, very similar. So in this first edition here, with kind of weird feeling cards, they don't feel quite the same as the cards from every edition after this and every expansion after this. We are starting out with, again, kind of like with Star Realms, a starter deck that everybody begins with the same. In this case, once again, just like Star Realms, it is 8 of one card, in this case called Apprentice, and 2 of another, Militia, making up 10. With a starting hand and all subsequent hands, at least without a draw card type effect going on, being 5 cards each. Again, just like Star Realms in that sense. Now also, just like in Star Realms, you're dealing with basically 2 main currencies to keep track of, at least in the base game of Ascension, and one other number to track that essentially relates to winning the game. In this case, we have runes, which are basically these little pyramid-looking things made out of crystal, and then the red symbol with the blade through it called power. Again, if you're comparing this back to the video done recently on Star Realms, those equate to trade and combat. One of them is going to be used to acquire cards from a row on the playing surface, though in this case, it'll have a different name and a different number of cards. And power, equivalent to combat, is going to be used for attack. But you're not attacking the other player directly. That's one of the ways in which this game does vary. The other currency beyond runes and power, if you want to call it a currency or a number to keep track of, is what's referred to as honor. The premise here is that there's this great evil that's been re-released out into the world after a very long time. And you, as perhaps the Godslayer, are a warrior trying to recruit allies to get new technologies and such, and defeat monsters along the way to fight evil. So in a sense, both players are fighting the same enemies out there. They're all fighting this evil and its minions. But the one who manages to accumulate the most honor by getting the best allies and defeating the most monsters and so forth, will wind up being considered the Godslayer, the winner of the game, because while both were out there doing good, one simply did more good than the other. In essence, these honor tokens, as they're called, red for 5, clear for 1, these are essentially acting not only as a way of tracking how well you're doing, but also a way of limiting the amount of time that the game is allowed to take. So when I'm looking at this honor here, right, again, red for 5, clear for 1, I'm looking at basically 60 honor there sitting in what's referred to as an honor pool. There's no actual space on this board dedicated to it. Subsequent sets will have them, just not in this first edition. Now that honor pool represents a couple of things, because as you play and you defeat monsters or certain card effects happen, you gain honor. You do that by taking honor out of the pool. So maybe I gained 2 honor, I take 2 out and it goes on my side of the playing area. And eventually, once that's happened enough times, all those tokens, all those honor tokens will disappear. You'll have run out. And what happens then is you are able to still accumulate honor, whether just marked on paper, kept in mind, done using extras or ones from other sets. You can keep accumulating honor, but as soon as that pool is empty, and it starts with 30 for each player, so if a 2-player game, 60 like we have here. As soon as that's empty, whoever took their first turn last will mark the end of the game. So for instance, if it just so happens that this player went first, this player went second, this player winds up being the player on whose turn that pool empties, this player will still get another opportunity to play a turn before the game is officially over. It makes sure that everyone has an even number of turns. It's just sort of making sure that the game doesn't go over long, so it limits the amount of time. Now, it's not the only way you gain honor. Honor is what you will add up at the end of the game to figure out who's done the most good, who's won the game. You'll count up all the tokens you've acquired, but the cards you acquire will also often have an honor amount in the bottom left corner, and you'll add that up as well. So in essence, you'll have 2 totals, the amount from your cards and the amount from your tokens. You'll add them together, and that's what's going to decide your total honor for the game. So you're tracking runes, power, and honor in this case. The setup, otherwise, very similar to Star Realms, except sort of reorganized here. We have a row going on. They call this in this game very simply the center row. Notice in this case, it's 6 cards, whereas in the case of Star Realms, it was 5. As we play, if any card leaves, it is immediately replaced, very much like the case of Star Realms, and it's being replaced from this. Now, interestingly, it's called the center deck in most of these expansions, but on the original game, even though it says center deck in the rules, it says portal deck there on the play surface. This is not, by the way, a separate purchase, this game board. Ascension's big box sets always come with their own custom game board. So no going out and having to buy play mats to be able to play Ascension on a surface that is marked. This is, though, one of only a small number that actually have the parts of your turn listed actually on the playing surface. So you have a deck to pull from to replace the cards in the row. You have the row. They're just called center instead of trade this time like Star Realms has. And just like Star Realms, you do have some always available cards, just in case you're in a situation where you've got runes to spend, but nothing really here that interests you or that you have the amount to spend it on, or you have power to spend and nothing here to attack. Well, in this case, rather than having 1, we have 3. We have a Mystic that gives you 2 runes, is worth 1 honor, costs 3 runes to acquire. Heavy Infantry costs 2 runes to acquire. 1 honor is added to it because it's going to be part of your total for your cards, and 2 power each time you play it. This Cultist here, it's only 1 card. You don't ever actually pick that up and take it anywhere. You just attack it with your power. So in this case, if this was the player's hand, they have 3 runes generated, 2 power generated. So for those 3 runes, they could purchase anything that costs 3 runes. We'll take a look at that again in a second. Or attack something that has a combat value of 2 or a power value of 2. Well, just like you've got your number up in the corner representing how much something costs in runes, very much like trade in Star Realms, when it comes to actually attacking a monster, it has a different number in the corner, which is representing its combat value, or its power rating. So I've got 2 power. I can't do anything to meth it because it's got a power of 3. I can, however, go after this cultist, right? So it's there in case I can't do anything else with this currency. I attack it. I don't actually take it anywhere. I simply read the effect when I kill it, and this cultist is dead. It says, reward, 1 honor. That's when I would pick up an honor token and take it over. Honor is basically a number inside a black star with a gold outline. Now, if I do that, and I defeat a different monster, let's say I had more than 2 and went after Mephit here, defeating a monster means I get whatever this reward text is. In this case, gain 2 honor, you may banish a card in the center row. I will then take that monster and send it to the void, essentially where it's lost for eternity. And then immediately I'll replace that with another card. Notice it said you could banish a card in the center row. That's the same thing. You would just take a card out of the center row and send it to the void. Sending something to the void is sort of taking it out of play, very much like sending something to the scrap pile or scrapping something in Star Realms. Also, like in Star Realms, you do deal with factions here, though they play less of a role in this set than they will in some of the other sets. And you have 2 main types of cards beyond monsters. Monsters always get attacked, killed, sent into the void, and give you a reward, with exceptions in later sets, but in this set, basically always. But you also have these cards that you can acquire by paying your runes, so this costs 1, costs 4, costs 3, costs 5, 4, 1, whatever the corner says. And among them you have heroes, which play like a regular card. On your turn, you would simply put it down and play it, and get its effect. Just like most deck building games, it's not going to cost you anything to play a card, but it does cost you to acquire it in the first place. You will acquire it, put it in your discard pile. Eventually, the next time you have to draw a card and your discard pile has all your cards, so there's no deck to draw from anymore. You shuffle the discard pile, it becomes your new deck. You start drawing from it. So slowly but surely, all the cards that you've acquired wind up shuffled into your deck as you go along, getting progressively stronger. So in this case, I'll have to replace it. And we have another type called a construct. Now, construct is a lot like those bases we saw with Star Realms, whereas a hero gets played, and at the end of a turn, with all the other cards in your hand for that turn, played or not, is going to go into your discard pile. A construct, instead, sits out and stays active throughout the game until something destroys it or you're forced to at some point discard it for any reason. It's not about protecting you or protecting anyone like the bases were in that sense, those outposts in Star Realms, but it is similar in the sense that it gets laid out and has a continuous effect on the game. So heroes and constructs are your 2 types. When it comes to factions, you have a few different factions here. It's 4 again. You have the Enlightened. You have Lifebound. You have Mechana, or Mechana. I always say Mechana. I've heard some people say it as Mechana. Whatever. And Void. And there are some abilities that, for instance, say, hey, if you've played another card of this type during your turn, you get this extra bonus. But it's not something that necessarily is a heavy part of this game. It happens, but it's not nearly as big as, for instance, in Star Realms, where tons of cards have that special line that has their ally symbol on it or their faction symbol, and as long as you play another of that type, you get that bonus. That's a big part of Star Realms, not necessarily a big part of Ascension. Ascension is more about a lot of wildly varying card text that lets you do things. Like in this case, if you have this sitting out, because it's a construct, once per turn you'll gain an extra power. Once per turn, you may spend 4 runes to gain 3 honor, and the card itself is worth 2 honor. So this is a great one for slowly but surely building up that honor that's going to help you win the game in the end. Because remember, it's not just about who gets the most of these, or who has the highest total amongst the cards that they have. It's both combined together. Otherwise, it works pretty similarly. But when it comes to a comparison to Star Realms, the variations in what you get as far as card abilities, the fact that you're essentially kind of cooperating against the darkness, but you're really competing, there's no actual cooperative element of the game beyond just the concept of what you're doing story-wise, and the fact that you've got some more options as far as number of cards out in the center row. You have things that you can actually attack in the row as opposed to just the other player or something. You have more of those always available cards out. It's just another step beyond Star Realms in terms of complexity. Yet still relatively easy to get someone new into deck building games into this game as opposed to some of the more complicated versions out there like, say, Marvel Legendary. Or, God forbid, Legendary encounters Firefly that's incredibly complex. I love it, but it's really complex. This is pretty straightforward. Now you'll notice here, perhaps, that that's quite a few cards. This first edition actually has 100 cards for the center deck. Has, of course, the one Cultist, because there's only ever a need for one. It just kind of sits there. 30 Mystics, 29 Heavy Infantry, and enough cards of Apprentices and Militia, which are for your starting deck, right? 8 Apprentices, 2 Militia, for 4 players to be able to play. This is where I've stuck all the other ones up here, plus enough honor tokens, 25 small, 25 large, so 50 total, along with the game board, that basically for a little bit more than you'd spend on something like Star Realms, you'd be able to come in and have a game that can be played by 2 players, 3 players, 4 players, without having to buy anything else. Whereas with Star Realms, once you get past 2 players, you got to buy another one of those starter packs or pick up Colony Wars. Gotta say, Ascension is one of my favorites. Now, all the ones showing up on this channel are favorites, so it's kind of, it's easy for me to say that. But as the game goes along, it has some interesting complexities from different expansions. I will say also, this one is the one that my wife likes the most. She has also played the various ones that I've played, and we've played those together. But for her, it's all about Ascension, because it doesn't get quite as complex and sometimes confusing as what we get with the Legendary games. It's not quite as basic as Star Realms, and it's a little more fast-paced, I guess you'd say, depending on how your cards are being drawn, than what you'd see sometimes with a DC deck-building game. Those are all games we'll eventually wind up looking at here as part of this playlist. Now, I did notice this is a first edition. The package basically looks like this. Back in the days when they were called Gary Games. And they do a pretty good job of giving you a nice detailed rulebook. Although, one downside, Ascension is really good at thematically matching its gameplay and its expansions with the story it's developing around this evolving world. And there's really not much of a story in the first edition version of the rules, if that matters to you. I note 2 other quick things here also, before we look at the other editions very quickly. One is that there are some other variants of play that are available here. Multiplayer is sort of already built into the game itself for 2 players or more. There's no special variants for multiplayer with the exception of team play. And there is a solitaire method of play, though not with a particular scenario like what we got back with Star Realms. I would also note that in terms of the turns, they work very similarly. It's essentially 3 different parts to the turn, just like Star Realms. You're playing your cards to acquire heroes, to defeat monsters and such. You eventually do a discard, and then you draw cards again. And I guess I should note, see, here I am thinking of other things to mention also, that the whole thing about 30 honor per player is something that actually took effect with the 2nd edition of the base game. The original 1st edition, for those who are curious, had it so that basically it was 60 for 2 players, but then instead of 90 and then 120 as you go to 3 and 4 players, it went from 60 to 75 to 90. So once you got past 2 players, it was only 15 that were being added for each additional player. That didn't seem like enough, so they wound up changing it by the 2nd edition of this base set to make it just 30 for each player, regardless of how many players you're dealing with. Now, as you move to the second edition of this earliest version of Ascension, this first set, Chronicle of the Godslayer, you're going to find that there's relatively little changed. This is the board for the first edition, and this is the board for the second edition. Really, all that they did, it seems, was just darken it. Otherwise, it's the same. The cards themselves also took on a bit of a nicer feel, a more standard feel, than sort of the weird feeling version of the cards for the first edition. And they also acquired a symbol and colored dot down in the bottom. They would tell you which set it was from and the number of them you would expect to find in the center deck. For what it's worth, for that little one down in the corner, basically there would be only one copy of something that had kind of a golden yellow color, 2 copies if it was blue, 3 copies if it's like a whitish silver, and then ones like these that are sort of reddish orange would have 4 copies in that center deck. They would come up with a better way to represent that in the future. Otherwise, it was pretty much the same. It's a revised rule book that was almost identical, aside from things like the honor token differences and actually having to point out the rarity stuff. And you can tell it's second edition by the little symbol down here. I've seen second edition actually out by Gary Games or their later name Stoneblade Entertainment. Same game, though. And basically the same box here. Chronicle of the Godslayer, second edition down in the corner being the only main thing to differentiate here. Now the third edition, it did step things up a bit because it came quite a bit into the life cycle of the game, and it changed its name. Even though the first set is still recognized as Chronicle of the Godslayer, it simply was changed to say Ascension Deck Building Game 3rd Edition. The new packaging looked a little spiffier. 3rd edition down there on the bottom, and you have a spiffier new set of rules that's been revised just a tiny bit and includes a great story setup for the game. Moreover, the game changed visually. It has all the same cards in it as the second and first editions, but the cards themselves have been designed differently, as has the board. The board has now removed all the little bits that told you what the parts of the turn were, which freed things up. The void has moved over to the other side. The portal deck is no longer labeled as such, and is now just right at the end of the 6 spots for the center row. You have a spot for the honor pool, so all your honor tokens and such, and the cultist, mystic, and heavy infantry have changed order and moved from this side up to the top. It's just a nicer, cleaner look to that board and to the cards. This is a first edition version of Arha Initiate. The second edition version is the same, it just has a little dot in the corner to tell the rarity and what set it's from. This is the new one for 3rd edition. Same cards, same effect. They've changed some of the flavor text a little bit. Still Enlightened Heroes, still the same name, different art. I tend to think of it as better art, personally. And same cost, different frame around it. And down at the bottom, they've come up with a better way to track the number and what's set. Now you have a symbol, in this case that 3, Roman numeral 3, stylized to say it's 3rd edition. And the number of dots will tell you how many of them are in the center deck instead of having to do a color-coded thing where you got to check in the manual to figure out what the codes mean. The card backs still look the same. The standard cards also got upgrades, like the Cultist, the Mystic, Heavy Infantry, Militia, and Apprentice. So think of 3rd edition as just the cleaned up, nicer version of that initial game. Any errata has been pretty much taken care of here. The downside is that this new cleaner, cooler look to the game didn't translate over to the digital game. The digital game still shows all the cards from the first set using their 1st or 2nd edition images. Now, I didn't mention price when I talked about the first 2 editions because they're not really available anymore outside of second-hand dealers like on eBay. But you can still get the 3rd edition. That box set runs you $40. So it's good for players up through 4. There's a lot of cards in it, and it's got a game board that's included with it. But that does mean you're looking at more than double the price of picking up a 2-player starter for Star Realms, if you want to start there, and still actually paying 10 bucks more than if you were to pick up 2 Star Realms starters, whether it's the original as 2, Colony Wars as 2, or the original and Colony Wars to give you 2 to be able to play 4 players with that game. But again, this is sort of a step up in terms of the depth of the game and in terms of what you get within the box itself. This is, again, highly, highly recommended. If you don't play the physical game, at least try out the app, because you can play with the base set on the app, this set here, for free. I would also note, before we leave this original set behind, that there is one other way to get it, and that's as part of what's referred to as the Year 1 Collector's Edition. Year 1 Collector's Edition is going to run you $100 if you're getting it at retail price. I've reviewed this before on the channel. You essentially have a nice tin to hold everything in. It comes with a nice fancy foil version of the game board, which includes a Year 1 note down there. It's actually designed very much like the original 1st and 2nd edition, where it's got your always available cards off to the side, your center deck, which again it had called the Portal deck at one point, the Void, your center row, and in this case actually gives you a place for the honor pool. Again, no listings there of the different parts of the turns. All of your cards are going to come in a very nice card box. You have all of your honor tokens inside a nice little drawstring bag, as opposed to the regular sets that just have them in the little plastic bags. And you have nice dividers for your individual sets. You'd also have an updated rule book that specifically focuses on the contents of this package. This package is essentially a collector's edition version with foil cards of promos and what you need to play from the first 2 sets. So remember our 3rd edition look to the cards? Same thing, except they're all foil now. It then includes 1 cultist, 30 mystics, and 30 heavy infantry rather than 29, as was the case with the 1st through 3rd editions of that original set, Chronicle of the Godslayer. It comes with 6 starting decks of 8 apprentices and 2 militia each. That's because this also includes all of these center row cards, the center deck cards, from the 1st set, Chronicle of the Godslayer, and the 2nd set, Revenge of the Fallen. And that 2nd set is a smaller box set, which includes enough starting decks for 2 players. So you combine the 4 with the 2, you've got enough for 6. Though you're not getting extra cultists or extra other always available cards, because you're not ever going to play with more than just the starting amount of 30, or 29 in the case of those original versions. Rather than 50 honor tokens, you've got 70 of them in here, in case you want to play with a little more. You've got basically in here 35 and 35 instead of 25 and 25 of the ones worth 1 versus the ones worth 5. And when you take into account the different sets, you have 100 cards, the same as in the other editions, 100 cards for the center deck from the initial set, right? Ascension deck building game or Chronicle of the Godslayer, whatever you want to call it. 65 cards from Return of the Fallen, the 2nd set, the first of the small expansions, and 60 cards that are all various promos. And in many cases, this is the first time those Year 1 promos are getting the nicer look from the 3rd edition and the foil treatment both, rather than just being something that's already got a nicer 3rd edition look and is just getting a new foil treatment. Given that Chronicle of the Godslayer, or just the 3rd edition deck building game, whatever you want to call it, is basically 40 bucks, and Revenge of the Fallen is 30, you are paying a bit of a premium here to get those promo cards, the foil treatment, the little drawstring bag, the dividers, the box, the foil version of the board, because it is 100 bucks as opposed to 70. But then you wouldn't have the promo cards and would have to order them separately somehow, say off of Ascension's website or picking them up on eBay. For my money, if you're gonna dive headlong into Ascension and you know you're gonna play with more than one set, you know you're really gonna get into this, I would actually say try to hunt down the collector's edition for a decent price if you can. The quality of the materials is top-notch. So whichever you're going to play, whether we're talking Chronicle of the Godslayer 1st edition or 2nd edition, deck building game 3rd edition, or deck building game Year 1 Collector's Edition, I would highly recommend checking out Ascension. When it comes to a nice balance between complexity and speed of play and ease of use, I gotta say, this is one of the best of the deck building games out there. Though again, if you just want to try it out, you can save the money and go for the digital game instead. It's available on the app stores. Coming up in the playlist, an even easier and cheaper way to check out Ascension and the Ascension expansions.